Catherine Mercer had spent $83 million trying to get better, and she was losing weight she could not afford to lose. The most credentialed specialists in the country had reviewed her case. She had flown in a consultant from Montreal and another from a clinic in Zurich, with an 18-month waiting list. Her own company, Helix Biosciences, manufactured 3 of the immunosuppressant drugs currently approved for the autoimmune neurological disorder she had been diagnosed with, and still, 10 months into treatment, her hands shook when she poured her morning coffee. Her vision went soft at the edges on afternoons, when the infusion suite on the 11th floor of the Helix Tower should have been doing its work. Not one of the people drawing a salary to keep her well had stopped to ask the obvious question: why was the treatment making her worse instead of better? Warren Koble noticed. He was pushing a utility cart through the 11th floor corridor at 7:20 on a Tuesday morning, when he saw her sitting in the infusion chair through the narrow observation window in the treatment suite door. He was not supposed to look. He had taught himself in the 14-month he had worked maintenance in this building, not to look at things that were not his assigned problem. But his eyes caught the angle of her wrists resting on the armrests, and something in him went still the way it used to go still years ago, standing in a factory or a grain elevator or a chemical processing plant, when a worker's presentation did not match the reported exposure history. He pushed the cart past the door. He did not stop moving, but the image stayed with him the way significant things stay, not loudly, but with a low frequency that has not finished being understood. Warren left his apartment on Elgin Avenue at 6:10 every morning. He made oatmeal with brown sugar and 2 slices of toast, poured coffee into a thermos, and walked his 8-year-old daughter Nadia to the school bus stop on the corner of 26th before taking the C train downtown. It was a routine he had built after Patricia died, not because routine felt natural, but because, without it, the mornings became shapeless, and a shapeless morning in a quiet apartment with a child who was watching him to know how to feel was a thing he could not afford. Nadia always did the same thing at the bus stop. She unzipped the front pocket of her backpack and handed him whatever she had put there the night before. A smooth stone she'd found at the park. A folded page torn from a coloring book. That Tuesday, she pressed a laminated card into his hand, the kind children made at school with construction paper and a plastic pouch, and said, without looking up from her mittens, "It's your helper card, Dad, for when you fix things." He turned it over. She had drawn a figure in a gray jumpsuit with the word Warren printed in careful block letters across the front, holding what appeared to be a wrench in one hand and a clipboard in the other. Around the figure she had drawn small arrows pointing inward, the way she drew sunbeams, as though the figure were a source of something. He put the card in the breast pocket of his jacket and kept it there all day. The 11th floor of the Helix Biosciences Tower did not look like a place where someone worked a maintenance shift. The carpet was charcoal wool. The lighting diffused through frosted panels that created the impression of natural light without its variability. The treatment suite at the north end of the corridor had been designed to feel like a private consultation room rather than a clinical space. Warm-toned cabinetry, upholstered infusion chairs, a view of the Bow River that on clear days reached all the way to the mountains. Warren had been assigned here 14 months earlier, after a vetting process his supervisor called unusually thorough. The building needed someone reliable, someone with clean hands and no reason to be careless. Warren's record was clean because, after Patricia died, he had quietly let his environmental health certification lapse and spent nearly 2 years adrift before taking a job that asked nothing of him beyond showing up and doing the work correctly. The mortgage and Nadia's after-school program did not care what he used to be. He had been an environmental health officer for 9 years. He had investigated occupational exposure cases for the province, measured particulate levels in asbestos abatement sites, mapped contamination plumes in industrial yards, documented the ways invisible things in the air and water and food supply accumulated in human tissue over time before announcing themselves in ways that by then were very difficult to reverse. He had been good at it. He had been the kind of investigator who noticed what was not in the initial complaint. The secondary exposure pathway, the pattern that only became visible once you understood that the body kept its own records with a precision human record-keeping rarely matched. When Patricia got sick, he had believed the people responsible for her care. He had sat in consultation rooms and nodded at explanations delivered with the careful authority of people who had spent more time learning medicine than he had spent in any room. He had watched his wife decline for 22 months, and when she was gone, he had spent 3 months pulling everything apart. The lab reports, the treatment notes, the referral letters, trying to understand how a previously healthy 41-year-old woman had deteriorated so completely under the care of competent physicians. He had never found a satisfactory answer. The toxicology at post-mortem had shown elevated inorganic arsenic in hepatic tissue. The pathologist had marked the source undetermined. Occupational exposure was noted as unlikely, given Patricia's work as a secondary school librarian. The file had been closed. Warren had not closed it. He carried it the way certain men carry unresolved things, not always in the front of his mind, but never entirely out of it either. He heard the nursing staff talking in the medication preparation room on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks after. He first noticed Catherine Mercer's wrists. He was replacing a corroded bracket on the return air duct above the supply closet, 2 doors down, working quietly, and the voices carried without the speakers realizing it. 16th session this month. The sound of a drawer opening and closing. And her CBC from Tuesday was worse than the one in September. A pause. Dr. Hartman says it's consistent with the immunosuppressive load. Says the lymphocyte picture will stabilize. A longer pause. I've been in oncology support for 11 years. That's not what lymphocyte destabilization looks like in an autoimmune presentation. The voices moved away. Warren finished with the bracket, sealed the access panel, and stepped into the corridor. He stood for a moment between the supply closet and the utility junction, alone, with the building's hum around him, and the particular stillness in his chest he recognized from inspection sites when the air sample results came back wrong. He had been looking at Catherine Mercer's hands for 3 weeks. Not staring, that had never been his way, and it was not what the work had trained into him. He looked the way he had always looked at environments he was assessing, peripherally, cumulatively, building a picture from fragments rather than a single focal point. What the picture showed him was this. The transverse white bands on Catherine Mercer's fingernails were not the product of trauma or an isolated nutritional disruption. There were 4 of them on her left hand. He had confirmed this on a morning when she had left the treatment suite door open, speaking to the nursing coordinator, and the east light had fallen across her hands at the right angle. 4 bands, parallel, evenly spaced. He had seen bands like these twice before in his professional life. Once on a foundry worker whose workplace exposure had been underreported for 6 years, and once on a woman who lived 3 blocks downwind from a metal reclamation facility and had been told for 2 years that her symptoms were fibromyalgia. Aldrich Mees lines, present in cases of heavy metal accumulation, arsenic most commonly, in chronic low-dose scenarios. Multiple bands evenly spaced meant multiple exposures at regular intervals, not an accident, not an environment, a schedule. He had also noticed, on the mornings Catherine Mercer walked the corridor before her sessions, a diffuse hyperpigmentation at the base of her hairline, not the sharp demarcation of sun damage but the even, dusty discoloration of systemic arsenic deposition in the dermal layer. Raindrop pigmentation, the textbooks called it, because the pattern looked like dark spots left on pale stone after rain. He had seen it once before, on the same foundry worker, And there was the fatigue in her gait, which was not the fatigue of a busy executive, but the fatigue of a body managing a load it could not put down. He said nothing for 10 days. He weighed what saying something would cost against what he understood about the cost of silence. He had been silent before. He knew that weight too. Warren called James Okafor on a Sunday evening in November. James was an internal medicine specialist at the Foothills Medical Center who had been Patricia's primary care physician before her diagnosis, and who carried, in the private way of physicians who cannot publicly process their clinical failures, something like the same weight Warren carried about those 22 months. James answered on the third ring. Warren described what he had observed the way he had trained himself to describe environmental findings. Specific, sequential, without interpretation until the evidence supported one. 4 transverse bands on the nails of the left hand, roughly 2 millimeters wide, at the base of the nail plate, consistent with repeated systemic insult at regular intervals. Diffuse hyperpigmentation at the posterior hairline, consistent with chronic arsenic deposition. Fatigue and peripheral neurological presentation, inconsistent with the autoimmune diagnosis on the chart. James did not speak for a long time. Then, the banding intervals, are they equidistant? As near as I could determine without direct measurement, yes. Another silence. Equidistant banding, on a regular treatment schedule. His voice was careful and controlled, the way it got when he was working through something he did not want to be working through. Warren. If those bands are what you're describing and the schedule is regular, someone is introducing the compound deliberately. Warren had known this since the corridor 3 weeks earlier. He had carried it the way he carried the cardboard box of Patricia's medical files in the cabinet above the refrigerator. Not as a conclusion he wanted, but as a fact the evidence would not let him set aside. He had the treatment calendar. He had photographed it from the scheduling board in the nursing station 6 weeks earlier, while replacing a ceiling tile above it. 16 sessions over 10 months. The intervals, 19 days, 19 days, 18 days, 19 days. As regular as a maintenance schedule, as deliberate as a dosing protocol. He put the phone down on the kitchen table and sat in the quiet apartment with Nadia asleep down the hall, November wind against the windows, the city's low frequency running under everything. He thought about the box above the refrigerator. He thought about Patricia's post-mortem toxicology and about the word undetermined, which he had never believed meant unknowable. He was not going to wait again. The next morning he requested 5 minutes with Beverly Chow, the clinical director who had overseen the treatment program for 4 years. She listened with the particular attention of someone trained to appear to listen carefully. When he finished, she said, "Mr. Koble, the clinical team managing Ms. Mercer's case has a combined experience of over 30 years in autoimmune and neurological medicine. I'm confident they're interpreting the presentation correctly." She smiled the gentle smile people use to close a door quietly. "Is there anything else about building operations I can help with?" He found Dr. Sylvia Hartman at the elevator bank at 8:45. 53 years old, trained at McGill and at a fellowship program in Germany, she moved through the building with the relaxed authority of someone who had never needed to consider being wrong in a room that included her. She listened for exactly 40 seconds, hands at her sides, expression composed. "I understand your concern," she said. "This is a complex immunological case with an atypical presentation. We have 17 specialists across 4 institutions actively reviewing the data. A pause calibrated for finality rather than hostility. I'm quite sure we're managing this appropriately." She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. Warren stood in the corridor in his gray uniform with his access card and his cart, and he said nothing because he had run out of institutional channels and had not yet found another way through. He ate lunch in the basement maintenance room, a cup of coffee and a sheet of paper folded in quarters. He had written 4 things in his small, precise handwriting: arsenic, Mies lines, chronic low-dose exposure, regular administration interval. His phone showed a message from Nadia's after-school program, a photo of a new drawing, a figure in a gray jumpsuit, a tall building, a smaller figure standing at the top beside the taller one, holding hands. He looked at it for a long time, then folded his own piece of paper and placed it in his breast pocket beside the laminated card. Over the following 4 days, Warren moved through the 11th floor the way he had always moved through environments he was formally assessing. Completely, without haste, attending to everything without drawing attention to any of it. He was invisible in the way people who maintain buildings are always invisible. In 14 months, no one on the clinical staff had learned his last name. He used the invisibility. The pharmaceutical waste from the 11th floor treatment suite was not routing through Helix's standard regulated disposal chain. He noticed this on the 2nd day during a late pickup at the biohazard station near the service elevator. A courier vehicle with no hospital affiliation decals and no provincial pharmaceutical waste contractor markings. He noted the vehicle identification number and the company name on its magnetic door sign, and ran the name against the provincial carrier registry that evening. It was not listed. He photographed the intravenous bags in the treatment suite preparation room during a scheduled pass to replace a faulty motion sensor. The primary labels were correctly formatted for pharmaceutical use, but on 2 of the bags, where the label adhesive had not fully seated, a secondary label showed beneath it. The lot number was not a format registered with Health Canada's Drug Identification Database. He knew what a compliant label looked like. He had reviewed enough exposure documentation over the years to recognize one that had never passed regulatory review. On the 4th day, moving his cart through the parking structure at 6:20 in the evening, he heard voices from the far end of the lower level and slowed without changing direction. Douglas Fenn, the company's CFO, stood beside a dark blue sedan, jacket buttoned against the cold. Dr. Hartman faced him. Warren caught 6 words before the structure's ambient noise swallowed the rest. "She's asking about the spring numbers." A pause. 3 months minimum. We need 3 months. Fenn gave a single tight nod, the nod of a man confirming an arrangement he did not want committed to anything with a timestamp. Warren sent the label photographs to James that evening through an encrypted messaging app. James's reply arrived at 2:40 in the morning. He had run the lot number through 4 pharmaceutical registry databases. It appeared in none of them. Whatever was in those bags had not been approved by any authority with the standing to approve it. Warren sat with that for a while, then sent back 2 words, "What now?" James's reply was immediate. "I need an independent blood draw, outside their lab system. If the arsenic is in her serum, the concentration will be measurable and incontrovertible. Can you get access to her before the morning session?" Warren considered it with the same methodical attention he brought to site assessments. He had a key to the 11th floor and a standing early morning ventilation check that put him there by 6:15 most days, before the clinical team arrived. And in 14 months, Catherine Mercer had walked past his cart perhaps 60 times. She had never looked through him the way the medical staff did. On 3 occasions, she had said good morning by name, not his full name, just Warren, and had, briefly and without significance, actually seen a person. That was a narrow advantage. He intended to use it. He was in the corridor at 6:08 on a Wednesday morning in late November, working slowly beside the ventilation access panel, paying attention to everything. At 6:14 the elevator opened. Catherine Mercer stepped out with a paper cup of coffee and the self-possession of a woman who had carved this 20-minute interval out of her schedule as an act of private preservation, time to be the building before it began managing her. She was 55. She had built Helix Biosciences from a research partnership she'd negotiated at 31, taken it through 2 regulatory approvals, and a partnership with the University of Calgary's medical faculty, and been named in 3 separate profiles as one of the most consequential figures in Canadian pharmaceutical development of the decade. She had done all of it while in the last 3 years becoming progressively less able to carry her own briefcase up a flight of stairs without stopping to breathe. She walked to the end office and put her key in the lock. Then she looked up, because Warren was standing where he was standing, and she saw him. "Warren," she said, with the reflexive ease of someone whose memory for people was precise and not performative. "Good morning, Miss Mercer." He did not move toward her. "I need to speak with you about something that doesn't have anything to do with the building." She looked at him for 1 full second, then she opened the door. "Come in." He stood near the window and showed her the photographs on his phone. The secondary label beneath the primary one, the lot number with no registry match, the vehicle identification from the after-hours waste pickup, the treatment calendar laid against the pattern he'd reconstructed. He described the nail findings the way he'd describe an environmental finding at a site. Specific, sequential, without drama. 4 transverse bands on the left hand, equidistant, matching an 18 to 19-day cycle that matched her recorded treatment schedule exactly. The hyperpigmentation at her hairline, the fatigue and neurological presentation inconsistent with the diagnosis on her chart. He did not editorialize. He let the pattern speak. Catherine Mercer did not speak while he talked. At some point, she set her coffee down and did not pick it up again. When he finished, she turned her hands over slowly, in the morning light, examining her own nails the way a person examines a familiar thing after being given new information about what it means. "Why you?" she said finally. It was a genuine question. "I lost someone," Warren said, to elevated arsenic in her tissue, 3 years ago. The source was listed as undetermined. He paused. "I don't believe undetermined means it can't be found. I've just never been able to find it before now." She looked at him then, not at his uniform or his clipboard or the cart visible through the open door. At him. "What do you need?" she said. "An independent blood draw. There's a physician I trust. He'll run the arsenic serum assay outside your facility's lab. If the concentration is there, it stands on its own. If I'm wrong, I won't raise it again." She was quiet a moment, then opened the lower right drawer of her desk and took out a sealed clinical specimen kit. Tourniquet, butterfly needle, collection tubes, alcohol swabs. "I completed 2 years of a medical degree," she said, "before the company needed more of me than the program did. I've kept one of these for 12 years because I've never been comfortable with complete clinical dependence on other people." A pause. "I've been asking myself your question since month 7. She drew the sample herself, hands steady with the muscle memory clinical training leaves behind long after the credential is set aside. Warren labeled the tubes to James's instructions and was out of the office by 6:31. The corridor was empty. Clinical staff began arriving at 7. James received the specimens before noon and ran the arsenic serum assay twice, 2 hours apart. The value was identical both times, 41 micrograms per liter. The Health Canada guideline for the general population was 15. The threshold for a regulatory incident was 25. Nothing in Catherine Mercer's diet, environment, or industrial proximity explained it. It was the product of regular, sustained, deliberate intravenous administration. James then ran the photographed bag's contents through a portable spectrometry unit he kept for consulting work. He found inorganic arsenic at a concentration that, delivered on a 19-day cycle, produced exactly the symptom progression Catherine Mercer had lived through for 10 months: fatigue, peripheral neuropathy. The neurological destabilization, her chart called immunosuppressive load, in the hands of a physician who controlled both the diagnosis and the treatment, poisoning and disease, had been made to look identical. The logic of it was clean and cold. Keep the patient sick enough to need the treatment. Keep her well enough to keep approving the budget for it. $83 million in 10 months, with the spring numbers already in discussion, because under this protocol there would always be spring numbers. Catherine Mercer received the full toxicology report at 11:15 that night. She read it alone in her office, in the chair she had sat in through 16 infusions of the compound making her ill. She did not cry. She stood at the mirror in the private washroom for a long time, looking at what she'd attributed to stress and to disease and now understood differently. And she did not flinch from any of it. She was a woman who had survived 30 years in an industry that did not make surviving easy for people who looked like her, and she had learned to look at difficult information with the same level gaze she brought to unfavorable financial projections. The information did not become less difficult for being looked at clearly, but it became workable. She thought about her father, who had started the research partnership that became Helix in a converted laboratory space in an Edmonton strip mall, who had believed pharmaceutical development was a form of moral work. She thought about what he would say about the bag that had been hanging above her chair. She called her personal legal counsel, then the head of her private security firm, and asked both to be in the building at 7 the next morning. By the following evening, the complete surveillance archive from the 11th floor, 14 months of footage held on a secure off-site server that Helix's security director had quietly maintained since a data loss incident 18 months earlier, had been fully reviewed. The relevant segments were unambiguous. Dr. Sylvia Hartman, alone in the treatment suite preparation room at 8:30 in the evening, on the night before each of Catherine Mercer's scheduled sessions, removing an unlabeled glass vial from a personal locked case and adding its contents to the primary IV bag through a secondary port. 16 instances, 16 evenings, each time-stamped and clearly lit, captured from 2 angles by cameras whose existence Dr. Hartman had evidently not considered relevant to her routine. The financial investigation took 48 hours. Douglas Fenn had been careful. 2 intermediary holding companies in different provinces, transfers structured as advisory retainers. But once a forensic accountant disentangled the trail, it was perfectly clear. 22 transfers over 10 months, totaling $3,800,000, to a numbered Alberta company whose sole director was one step removed from Sylvia Hartman's personal accounts. The payments had begun 4 months before Catherine Mercer's diagnosis. The diagnosis had been delivered by Sylvia Hartman. Warren received a message from Catherine Mercer at 2:50 Monday morning. "You were right, everything. Board meeting at 7 a.m. I'd like you there." He put the phone face down on the nightstand and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark, thinking about the box in the cabinet above the refrigerator, about the pathologist's careful language, about 22 months of believing the people in the consultation rooms, about what he had quietly given up after Patricia died, and whether some unexamined part of him had believed the giving up was a kind of penance for a thing he could not have changed but had never stopped feeling responsible for. He was not angry. He was something quieter and less temporary than anger. The version of himself that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for the pattern to become visible enough to act on while acting on it still mattered. He went to Nadia's doorway and stood there a while. She was asleep on her side with her arms around a stuffed bear, breathing with the easy rhythm of someone who had not yet learned to find sleep difficult. She had been 5 when Patricia died, and had spent 3 years in a household shaped by that absence, not bitterly but structurally, the way a room's proportions are defined by what is missing from it. She deserved a father who had not given up on the work he was actually built to do. He thought he might be close to being that again. The board convened at 7 on the 14th floor. The full board of directors was present, along with 3 of Helix's external counsel, 2 investigators from the forensic security firm, and a Health Canada compliance officer whom Catherine Mercer's lawyer had contacted the evening before. Warren stood near the windows in his gray uniform because she had asked him to be there, and he had no other appointment. Douglas Fenn arrived with his briefcase and his practiced composure and stopped moving when he saw the investigators. Sylvia Hartman came in 40 seconds later, scanned the room, and settled her expression into something carefully neutral that did not quite hold. Fenn looked at Warren and said, in the tone of a man identifying a procedural irregularity, "Why is maintenance staff present for a board meeting?" "He was invited," Catherine Mercer said, without looking up. She presented the evidence the way Warren had presented it to her, sequentially, without commentary, letting the data carry its own weight. The serum toxicology, the independent spectrometry, the surveillance footage, playing without narration. Hartman at the preparation counter, 16 separate evenings, the unlabeled vial, the unhurried movements of someone with complete confidence in her privacy. The financial records, transfer dates aligned against the treatment calendar. Hartman denied the footage for 2 minutes. Then the third evening segment played, and she stopped speaking. Fenn pushed his chair back and stood. An investigator set a hand on his shoulder, not firmly, but with a calm that was not going to move. The room was very quiet. Warren noticed that everyone was watching the screen except Hartman and Fenn, who were looking at the table, and Catherine Mercer, who was looking at him. He held her gaze a moment, and then the room began its procedural unwinding. Lawyers speaking low to the compliance officer, investigators moving with the efficiency of people executing a plan, and he stepped back to give them room. The consequences were swift. Sylvia Hartman was escorted from the building that afternoon, her clinical privileges suspended pending investigation by the College of Physicians and Surgeons. Douglas Fenn's corporate access was terminated, and his accounts flagged before the RCMP Commercial Crime Unit opened its file by end of business. The Health Canada referral went out before 5 o'clock. James Okafor was formally engaged as the independent physician overseeing Catherine Mercer's detoxification, a standardized chelation protocol, sourced from a licensed manufacturer with a complete traceable regulatory record. The first clean treatment began that Thursday. The first 10 days were in some ways harder than anything the preceding 10 months had produced. Chelation moved the accumulated arsenic through tissue that had carried it too long, and the body answered the way bodies answer when they are finally clearing something, with fatigue, with a temporary deepening of symptoms before the turn. Catherine Mercer sat through it in the same chair and did not pretend it was comfortable. On the 9th day, she walked from the parkade to the building entrance across 40 meters of open November pavement without stopping, the way a person walks when they expect to arrive. Warren found the envelope on his cart 3 weeks later, a plain white envelope, his name in the handwriting he recognized from the 3 a.m. message. Inside, 2 handwritten pages on personal stationery. She wrote about 10 months of being the most capable person in every room and simultaneously the most thoroughly deceived person in it. About what it had cost to keep believing the explanation while her body kept the opposite record. She had spent 2 years in a medical program and 10 months as a patient, and neither had given her what Warren Koble saw in 40 seconds through a door window with a utility cart in his hands, because the people paid to look had been paid, one way or another, to look at something else. The second page was a formal offer. Director of Environmental and Clinical Safety Oversight, a new position reporting directly to the board, responsible for independent review of every clinical vendor relationship, pharmaceutical sourcing decision, and treatment safety protocol across all Helix facilities. It was not a reward, she wrote. A reward would assume that what he'd done was exceptional. It was recognition that the role had existed in practice for 14 months and had simply lacked a title, a reporting line, and a salary calibrated to its actual importance. He folded the letter and placed it in his breast pocket, next to the laminated helper card Nadia had made him on the bus stop corner. He finished his route, collected his tools from the service locker at shift end, and walked out into the afternoon. Nadia was waiting at the school's front entrance, backpack on, a piece of paper held flat in both hands so the wind wouldn't fold it. She handed it over before he reached the bottom of the steps. "I made it at lunch," she said. "Monsieur Breckenridge helped me with the words." He unfolded it on the front walk. A tall building in blue crayon, every window a careful square. 2 figures on the roof, one tall, one small, holding something between them that might have been a hand or a rope bridge or both. At the bottom, in the large, careful print of a child who had recently discovered that writing things down gave them a kind of permanence. "My dad helps people. Do can't help themselves." Warren crouched down on the walk and held his daughter. For a long moment, the afternoon traffic running past and the winter light falling low and flat across the pavement. He had not helped anyone with authority, or credentials, or institutional permission. He had helped with the one instrument that had never entirely stopped working in him. Even in the years he'd deliberately set it aside. The willingness to look plainly at a pattern the body was producing and say what he saw, regardless of who was in the corridor, what they were carrying, or what it cost to keep looking after every other door had closed. He stood and took Nadia's hand. They walked toward the C train station together, the light coming across the street at the low, clear angle of a Canadian November. And for the first time in a long time, Warren Koble walked through it like a man walking toward something rather than away from it. $83 million had never asked the right question. One man with a calibration clipboard and a grief he had not finished carrying asked it instead. And in the asking, in his refusal to put down the part of himself that knew how to read what a body was quietly saying, he did the one thing the money never could. He arrived before it was too late.